Jerry Cohen is titular professor of social and political theory and fellow of All Souls, Oxford. In tonight's opinions, he argues that capitalism deprives people of their rightful share in the world's resources and that it frustrates the satisfaction of fundamental human needs.
I'm going to start with a story which was told by the American cartoonist Al Capp. The story is about a creature called the shmoo. The shmoo was 10 inches high, something like a pear in shape, and a beautiful creamy white in color. It had no arms, tiny feet, and big whiskers under its nose. The shmoo had only one desire, to serve the needs of human beings, and it was well equipped to do so. Its skin could be made into any kind of fabric. Its flesh was edible. Its dead body could go brick hard and be used for building. And its whiskers, well, its whiskers had more uses than you can imagine. If you looked at a shmoo with real hunger in your eye, it dropped dead in rapture because you wanted it, after first cooking itself into your favorite flavor. Well, since they multiplied rapidly, there were plenty of shmoos for everybody. And they even looked good in the environment. Almost everyone approved of the shmoos. But some people weren't keen on them. The rich capitalists hated the shmoos. Since shmoos provided everything people needed, nobody had to work for capitalists anymore, because nobody had to make the wages to buy the things capitalists sold. And so, as the shmoos spread across the face of America, the capitalists began to lose their position and their power, and this made them take drastic action. They got the government to tell the people that the shmoo was un-American. The shmoo was causing chaos, undermining the social order. People weren't turning up for work, and they weren't going to the department stores to buy anything. Well, the government propaganda convinced the people, and the president ordered the FBI to gather the shmoos and gun them down. Then things went back to normal. But a country lad called Little Abner managed to save one female and one male shmoo. He carried them off to a distant valley where he hoped they'd be safe. "Folks ain't yet ready for the shmoo," Little Abner sighed. But Little Abner was wrong. Folks were ready for the shmoo. It was only the capitalists that weren't. The capitalists didn't like the shmoo because it gave people independence. And when people don't depend on them for work and for goods, capitalists lose their privileged place. People haven't always depended on capitalists. They never, of course, had shmoos, but they did have land, and the things they get from shmoos in Al Capp's story, they got by working the land in pre-capitalist history. It's true that they didn't keep everything they produced on the land. Monarchs and their hangers-on and various lords and ladies were usually able to take quite a bit of their product. But the people didn't depend for their survival on any superiors until, after a long history of forced expropriation and plain and crooked dealing, they found themselves without any resources for producing things, except their own labor. And in order to survive, they had to hire themselves out to capitalists, who now had all the other resources. So we got a new setup, and in this new setup, workers sold their labor and capitalists bought it, and the buyers treated the sellers as nothing but sources of profit. So when the buyers didn't need all the labor that was offered, some workers were denied employment. And since they had no land or shmoos to live off, they became beggars and vagabonds and inmates of workhouses, or they simply wasted away. Well, of course, things aren't quite that bad now. Capitalism isn't as pure and ruthless as it used to be. The dispossessed workers defended themselves by uniting in trade unions, and the coming of the welfare state, with its public provision of necessities, means that workers don't depend for everything they need on finding someone who wants to buy their labor. The trade unions and the welfare state were savagely resisted by the capitalists, but they've come to stay. Now, advocates of pure capitalism describe it as a system in which people freely exchange their own private property. Socialists deny the freedom and fairness of that exchange. They complain that some are able to bring vast assets to market, while most people have nothing to sell except their own capacity to work. That's the socialist complaint. But against that socialist complaint, lots of capitalists will say, hang on a minute, wait a second. It's true that I have vast assets now, but I started with practically nothing except my own talent and courage, and it was by using them that I made my pile. You can't talk about lack of fairness. I had no unfair advantage in the race for wealth. Well, the socialist might reply that it's pretty rare these days for a capitalist to begin with brains and grit alone, but I want to focus here on just such self-made capitalists, since their wealth does look pretty legitimate. Well, if you think about that wealth, what's it made of? In its immediate form, it's just bits of paper, records and ledgers, share certificates, and so on. But the reason why those things are valuable is that they entitle their possessor to material resources, to raw and transformed parts of nature, to iron ore that's been turned into steel, to factories and energy and power lines and tracts of land and minerals under the sea. The capitalist is happy to tell us how he got all that stuff. He says, look, I got it through my own hard work and enterprise. I didn't get it from my parents. I didn't get it by stealing or cheating. But we can ask a deeper question, a question which is much more difficult for him to answer, a question which is prompted by the realization that everything he owns, everything, either is or was made of something which once was nobody's private property. The deep question is, how did it come to be anybody's private property in the first place? You see, the capitalist says that he got his wealth through free market exchange. And that means that he's defending his title to it by invoking the title of those who transferred it to him. But I'm asking, what was the source of their right to it? The fact that they got it from still earlier owners? Well, that kind of justification can't go on forever. Eventually we're going to be pushed back to the very first private owners of land and the raw materials of nature. And they didn't get them from earlier legitimate owners. They simply took nature's resources. And I'm asking, what gave them the right, not merely to use the world, because that's okay, but to establish permanent, bequeathable private property in it, so that others could no longer use it freely? What gave them that right? The self-made capitalist explains how, through honest industry and straight dealing, he accumulated an enormous amount of private property. But why was there that private property to accumulate in the first place? No story about the exchange and accumulation of private property can justify the transformation of things into private property in the first place. The fact that the world's resources were once privately owned by nobody and then grabbed supports the socialist idea that they should be restored to the people as a whole. But now I want to look at a different line of defense of capitalism, which says, come on, forget about past history, let bygones be bygones, don't be obsessed with the misty origins of capitalism. It doesn't matter how capitalist property came into being. Whatever the origin of capitalism was, it's an excellent system, since even the poorest people do better under capitalism than they would in any other form of economy. Well, the argument for the idea that capitalism promotes human benefit is pretty familiar. It goes something like this. Capitalist firms survive only if they make money, and they make money only if they prevail in competition against other capitalist firms. Since that competition is severe, the firm to survive has to be efficient. If firms produce incompetently, they go under. So they have to seize every opportunity to improve their productive facilities and techniques so that they can produce cheaply enough to make enough money to go on. It's admitted in this justification of capitalism that the capitalist firm doesn't aim to satisfy people, but the firms can't get what they are aiming at, which is money, unless they do satisfy people, and satisfy them better than rival firms do. Well, I agree with part of this argument. Capitalist competition, it has to be acknowledged, has induced a remarkable growth in our power to produce things. But the argument also says that capitalism satisfies people, and I'm going to claim that the way the system uses technical progress generates widespread frustration, not satisfaction. My anti-capitalist argument starts with the very same proposition with which the argument praising capitalism begins. Namely, this proposition: the aim of the capitalist firm is to make as much money as it can. It isn't basically interested in serving anybody's needs. It measures its performance by how much profit it makes. Now, that doesn't prove straight off that it isn't good at serving needs. In fact, the case for capitalism that I expressed a moment ago might be put as follows. Competing firms trying not to satisfy needs, but to make money, will in fact serve our needs extremely well, since they can't make money unless they do so. Okay, that's the argument. But I'm now going to show that the fact that capitalist firms aren't interested in serving human needs does have harmful consequences. Recall that improvement in productivity is required if the firm's going to survive in competition. Now, what does improved productivity mean? It means more output for every unit of labor. And that means that you can do two different things when productivity goes up. One way of using enhanced productivity is to reduce work and extend leisure, while producing the same output as before. Alternatively, output may be increased while labor stays the same.